In the second half of October 1944, Soviet forces crossed Germany's eastern border for the first time since the beginning of the war. The village of Nemesisdorf, located in East Prussia, was one of the first German settlements to be occupied, and its name was recorded as the site where the crimes that would later multiply began. The Red Army offensive managed to cross the Angarap River and advance a few kilometers further, although it soon withdrew. That brief stay in the village was enough to trigger a scene that days later shocked those who returned to the area. Nemesisdorf was a small community without notable strategic importance, but it became a symbol because of what the German troops and local citizens found upon returning. At first glance, the houses were looted, the walls pockmarked with shell hits, and the doors had been broken down. Inside the homes, the furniture was destroyed, personal belongings scattered, and the air smelled persistently of dampness, blood, and burned metal. In some rooms, windows were covered with torn blankets and broken curtains hung from only one side. What most disturbed those who explored the site were the lifeless bodies inside and outside the buildings. Several were lined up next to a barn. Others, lying on beds, showed signs of direct violence. Among the corpses were elderly women, some completely naked or partially covered with undergarments in positions suggesting a struggle. Others lay on tables, on the kitchen floor, or at entrances with wounds caused by blows, gunshots, and deep lacerations. Nearby, the remains of girls and elderly women with signs of assault were found, and in one underground shelter, more bodies were discovered, showing signs of execution at close range. The details of the autopsies were not fully released, but internal documents indicated fractures, internal tears, and injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. The condition of the corpses, along with the general disorder, suggested that what happened had been deliberate, not the result of an isolated skirmish. Survivors on the outskirts of the village reported hearing screams, gunfire, and vehicle noises throughout the night. Some said that at dawn they saw Soviet soldiers retreating in the opposite direction, leaving columns of smoke behind. A woman who had hidden in an attic mentioned seeing through a crack how several men entered the houses, dragged the occupants out, and took them toward the village center. Afterwards, the sounds she heard were screams and crying, followed by silence. She said she did not leave her hiding place until several days later, when German artillery could again be heard in the distance. German authorities quickly exploited the incident to publicize it. Recordings were made, photographs taken, and official reports sent to Berlin. Goebbels ordered extensive coverage in the news and the distribution of leaflets describing the events. The circulated images showed lined-up bodies, women covered with blankets, and walls stained dark. Reports indicated that Red Army soldiers had killed indiscriminately, raped women of all ages, and destroyed homes. One of the most impactful elements was the testimony of German doctors who performed the examination of the bodies. They reported that several victims showed signs of sexual assault, and some had been tied or restrained before being killed. They noted that the condition of certain corpses suggested the involvement of more than one person in the attacks. Mutilations were also recorded, reinforcing the narrative of extreme brutality. In one of the most widely circulated descriptions, it was stated that a woman had been found pinned to a barn door with bayonets, in a position coldly described in official documents. The psychological impact on the population was immediate. The dissemination of the events in Nemesisdorf generated panic in nearby regions. Displacements multiplied, with entire families leaving villages and seeking refuge in areas farther from the front. The presence of the Red Army began to be associated not only with the enemy's advance, but also with a direct threat to the lives and safety of civilians. German propaganda reinforced this perception with speeches portraying Soviet soldiers as uncontrollable, inhumane figures driven by resentment. Within days, Nemesisdorf became an emblematic case, cited in every official speech and mentioned in schools, newspapers, and radio broadcasts. The descriptions were repeated word for word by announcers reading the reports in front of state microphones. In some cities, photo exhibitions were organized where visitors could see the images on glass-covered panels. Public events were also held with speakers describing what had happened and warning about what could occur if the enemy was not contained. Despite its use in propaganda, what happened in Nemesisdorf was also acknowledged by external observers. Some foreign officers who visited the area shortly afterward confirmed the widespread destruction and the presence of bodies showing signs of violence. Although the exact interpretation of events varied by source, the main facts were not denied. A Hungarian officer accompanying an inspection delegation wrote in his diary that the scene was unbearable and that in his years on the front he had never seen such a precise combination of material destruction and human aggression. Some later researchers questioned the presentation of certain details, such as the position of the bodies or the exact number of victims, but they could not overturn the general impression already established. Memoirs of German soldiers arriving later in the village described an atmosphere of outrage. Many recounted that seeing what had happened changed the mood at the front. They stated that Nemesisdorf was a breaking point, a moment when combatants stopped thinking of the war as conventional and began to see it as an existential defense. On the ground, families attempting to return faced an uninhabitable scene. Houses were destroyed, roads impassable, and fields empty. There was no way to cultivate crops. Food supplies had been looted or burned, and animals were gone. Only charred remains, broken tools, and roofless walls remained. In some houses, messages were found written in charcoal in Russian, with words that made little sense to the local Germans, although the presence of such markers reinforced the idea of deliberate occupation. The German units that regained control of the area used Nemesisdorf as a reference point in their internal communications. Specific orders were given not to take alive any Soviet soldiers found nearby. Some commanders justified immediate executions as a direct response to what had occurred. Combat rules were tightened, and there was talk of avenging the victims. In many cases, military leaders did not intervene against individual reprisals by their men under the notion that the initial crime had been too severe to demand discipline. As the Red Army advanced in other sectors, similar accounts began to appear, although Nemesisdorf remained the most frequently cited case. What set it apart was its symbolic nature. It was the first village on German soil where a massacre accompanied by violence against civilians was documented. The fact that it occurred within territory considered national rather than in previous occupation zones heightened the emotional impact. For many, it was the concrete signal that the war had arrived at their doorstep in all its brutality. The memory of Nemesisdorf persisted in official documents, medical archives, press reports, and personal diaries. In subsequent years, some attempted to downplay its significance by citing propaganda use, but the scale of what was found was not denied. For those who lived through those days, the village's name became associated with the beginning of a different phase of the conflict. An era in which the front was no longer just a line on the map, but a tangible threat to every home and every person. Urban hell, the fall of Berlin, and the law of the victor. The troops of the Red Army reached the German capital at the end of April after an unstoppable offensive. The advance toward Berlin had become the central objective of Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev, with Stalin watching every move from Moscow. The two Soviet leaders competed for the honor of capturing the city, which led to a brutal siege amid widespread destruction. The sound of the cannons never stopped, and the streets were filled with smoke, fire, and collapsed buildings. Central Berlin was completely engulfed by the fighting, with German divisions trying to resist under increasingly desperate conditions. The defensive lines disintegrated one by one, and groups of soldiers were forced to retreat among ruins and debris. Fear and confusion dominated both combatants and civilians, trapped in basements and underground stations that offered insufficient shelter from the constant bombings. As Soviet artillery devastated the neighborhoods, thousands of women, elderly and children tried to hide underground. In some areas, the population had been evacuated, but in many others, people remained, believing the regime would hold out or that surrender would bring some order. The promises of the German leadership contrasted sharply with the total collapse taking place in the streets. The authorities no longer controlled anything, and propaganda messages were replaced by contradictory orders or by absolute silence. In that scenario, the Red Army intensified its presence and began taking control of key buildings. Every block was fought over with gunfire, and Soviet troops, driven by the sense of imminent victory, advanced relentlessly. The sound of gunfire was interrupted by screams, explosions, and the roar of armored vehicles. The fighting spread to courtyards, stairways, and tunnels. Soldiers opened fire in dark corridors, threw grenades through windows, and broke down doors with their rifle butts. There were no clear front lines. Everything was contested space. The fear of snipers was constant. In many cases, they were inexperienced youths or even armed civilians. Some fired from rooftops or holes in walls, and the Soviet response was often immediate and violent. Flamethrowers and explosives were used to neutralize any pocket of resistance, regardless of whether people were hiding inside. The devastation spread without distinction, and entire homes were consumed by fire. Stalin's orders were clear: advance at all costs. Zhukov pushed the pace forward without slowing for the losses. The number of wounded grew by the thousands, but the Soviet command did not back down. As soldiers moved through the heart of Berlin, the behavior of some battalions became increasingly uncontrolled. Many no longer distinguished between military targets and civilians. The city turned into a space of looting, destruction, and abuse. Shelter entrances were forced open, and those inside were either expelled or assaulted. Chaos was total. Public offices, stations, warehouses, and hospitals were occupied. Soviet flags appeared on every captured building, while the symbols of the German regime were destroyed. In the Moabit area, Soviet units surrounded and seized the prison, releasing the inmates indiscriminately. Some were common criminals, others political prisoners or deserters. Many joined the general disorder. Massive looting was seen in pharmacies, private homes, and food distribution centers. Cargo vehicles were stopped, emptied, and abandoned in the streets. No one knew for sure who was in command. Some Soviet officers tried to enforce discipline, but the scale of the operation and the lack of logistical control made it impossible. Alcohol, found in warehouses and cellars, circulated among the soldiers, worsening the loss of control. Numerous witnesses reported scenes of drunken soldiers firing into the air, fighting among themselves, or attacking civilians without cause. Meanwhile, in the German command posts, communication became impossible. Telephone lines were down, and messengers could not cross the firefights. The remaining units acted on their own initiative. Some groups tried to flee west in hopes of surrendering to the Americans, while others kept fighting out of instinct, or simply because no formal order to surrender had arrived. The German High Command had no real control over what was happening. Even inside Hitler's bunker, confusion reigned. Decisions were made based on incomplete information, and the atmosphere was one of resignation. Just a few meters from the center of Nazi power, the Red Army already controlled entire streets. The civilian population trapped between the two armies had no one to turn to. The regime's promises of protection went unfulfilled. Churches closed their doors, social services had collapsed, and the police no longer patrolled. Some tried to escape through the subway tunnels, but many were flooded or blocked. In other areas, makeshift routes were created through the rubble to move between houses or search for food. In several districts, spontaneous groups of neighbors formed to protect the most vulnerable. Some tried to negotiate with Soviet soldiers using watches, food, or documents. Sometimes that prevented violence, but it was never a guarantee. In the zones where fighting continued, bodies lay abandoned in the streets for days. The state of the city was irreversible. Main avenues were unrecognizable, asphalt shattered, trees uprooted, facades destroyed. Buildings still standing bore bullet impacts, shrapnel holes and broken windows. Smoke hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Daily life had disappeared. Water supply was non-existent, and electricity worked only in isolated sectors and for brief moments. Food was scarce, and fear had become the only constant. Children cried endlessly, the elderly stayed silent, and mothers tried to maintain a semblance of routine amid the chaos. The noise of tanks, machine gun bursts, and shouted orders in Russian set the rhythm of each day. When the fighting finally began to subside, the city fell completely under the control of the Red Army. What followed was not the restoration of order, but an occupation without clear structure. Some soldiers patrolled, others drank, and many took whatever they could find. Looting was common, from watches to mattresses, and whatever couldn't be carried was destroyed. In some neighborhoods, residents gathered to ask for help, but were ignored. The Soviet hierarchy took time to establish control mechanisms, and during those days, Germany's capital lived through one of the darkest episodes of its modern history. Survival pacts, protecting oneself by surrendering. Early in the morning, the front door opened and closed several times, while heavy footsteps, forced laughter, and foreign voices were heard going up the stairs. A moment later, the neighbors who lived downstairs ran upstairs and knocked insistently, saying that the soldiers had found them hiding in the basement, that one of them had a revolver and forced them to come out. They were trembling as they recounted that an officer had tried to protect them but could not stop the others, and one of them appeared to be in shock and could not speak, while at the same time screams were heard from other rooms and everything was confusing. A younger woman tried to calm the group even though she herself had torn clothes and red eyes and all hid in the pantry, cramped and silent, while outside there were sounds of banging and doors opening. Several hours passed before the house settled down. An elderly lady who had been a teacher tried to organize the others, saying it was best to stay together and avoid confrontations. She suggested taking turns to watch the stairs and whispered that it made no sense to shout or beg, as that only provoked more violence. No one responded. There were serious faces and others blank, and some women stayed huddled in a corner feeling that no one would help them. Later, an elderly man appeared at the door, a neighbor who had gone out to get food, and said that in other streets there were similar scenes and that the soldiers were going house to house. He mentioned that in some places women had tried to resist and the results had been worse. At dusk, one of the women, about 30 years old, decided to leave the hiding place and go down to the lower floor, saying she preferred to speak directly with the officers and ask for protection, and no one tried to stop her. A couple of hours later, she returned with a serious but intact face, reporting that she had spoken with a commander who, surprisingly, had offered her some help. She explained that he and the men were going to stay in the building for a few days and would not tolerate disorder while there. He added that any woman who wanted to stay close to him would have greater assurance of not being harassed, and it was not necessary to explain what that implied. There was a long silence, and that night 2 more neighbors came down with her. The next day, the house remained relatively calm. There were commands and movement, but the entrances were guarded. Those who had approached the officer brought some food, a bit of bread, and a couple of cigarettes. The atmosphere was tense, though less chaotic, and while some women remained hidden, others began to understand that the only way to maintain some control was to establish some kind of arrangement with the officers. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. An elderly woman murmured that she preferred that to being dragged away by a group of strangers in the middle of the night, and another replied that she no longer knew which was worse. The younger women seemed absent, sitting with blank stares, and there was little conversation, sharing food in silence. Occasionally, someone cried quietly. In the afternoon, other soldiers arrived, and the senior officer spoke firmly as if setting boundaries. One of the newcomers tried to approach the stairs but was stopped, and some women watched from above, thanking the commander with a gesture without getting closer. That same day, one of the neighbors decided to leave, saying she preferred to seek refuge in a church or another neighborhood. She said goodbye with a tired expression and did not return. Night fell without incident, and footsteps and voices in Russian were heard, but no one else went up to the second floor. The women slept in their clothes, many with knives under their pillows, and it was difficult to tell if the commander's presence was a guarantee or just a pause. Over the following days, the situation became almost routine. Women who stayed close to the officers had access to food, hot water, and basic protection, and in return spent time with them in silence and with neutral expressions, without anyone asking for details. The others kept their distance but no longer judged, and each made her own decisions. The priority was survival. Some talked about moving to other buildings, and others planned to wait until the troops moved. Small groups formed to support each other, and the older women tried to console the younger ones. The men, few in number, avoided intervening, although a couple performed minor tasks for the soldiers, like cleaning or repairing things, trying to protect themselves as well. The usual hierarchy of the building had disappeared. Medical consequences of violence, infections, and forced abortions. In several hospitals in Berlin, medical staff began to notice a steady increase in women arriving with physical injuries that could not be attributed to accidents or common illnesses. In the health centers of the Neukölln district, doctors treated a growing number of patients with internal injuries, poorly healed tears, and visible signs of advanced infections, and the women arrived without speaking much, some barely stating their names, others not even that, showing only exhausted bodies, high fever, persistent bleeding, dizziness, or pain that would not subside. Clinical reports, though written with administrative coldness, documented that many of these women had not only been attacked but also faced serious medical consequences. Vaginal infections were as frequent as untreated physical wounds. Some showed symptoms of syphilis or gonorrhea. Others had abscesses, open sores, or advancing inflammation, and antibiotics were scarce, dressings improvised, and many were sent back home because there was no space to admit them. In emergency rooms, gynecologists tried to alleviate pain with whatever was at hand. They knew that many patients did not want to speak and that they were not there voluntarily. Minimal measures were applied with the few resources available: occasional ointments, reused gauze, basic tools. The shortage of staff and supplies prevented proper care. Some women had continuous fever, others could not urinate without pain. The younger ones arrived accompanied by their mothers, the older ones alone or with neighbors. No one asked questions, it was enough to see them. In other districts, hospitals faced the same situation, and the pattern repeated: women showing signs of being forced without access to early care and with bodies deteriorated by uncontrolled infections. Sometimes the injuries had been caused by objects, further complicating treatment. Some patients did not return for follow-up. Others were seen days later in worse condition, with higher fever and unable to walk. In medical reports, doctors began writing generic phrases like advanced infection state or internal complications to avoid detailing the obvious. In some cases, women arrived with severe sepsis, beyond saving, dying without anyone officially recording the real cause. The patient overload in medical centers generated tensions that went beyond healthcare. Many professionals began leaving records of cases impossible to document precisely. In some reports, simply serious condition was noted without specifying whether it was infections, trauma, or multiple sequelae. Priorities changed daily. What was urgent one day was displaced the next by even more critical cases. Some teams tried to establish care criteria, but maintaining them was impossible. There were lists that were never completed, supplies that disappeared before use, and shifts that stretched without rest. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the staff became part of the general atmosphere. No one talked about solutions, only about surviving a few more hours. At the Neukölln Hospital, one of the most overloaded centers, a special registry was created for women with unwanted pregnancies. The list grew every week. Some arrived fearful, others angry, all seeking the same thing: termination. A process they had not chosen. They did not request it for ideological reasons or poverty. It was a medical, physical, and emotional decision. Many had been attacked by multiple men on a single day or on several occasions. Some were children. Social workers recorded age, general condition, and environmental factors, then referred the case to a doctor if one was available. Sometimes none was. Women waited for hours in crowded hallways, where the smell of sweat and disinfectant mixed with the cries of children and the constant murmur of exhausted people. Some fainted, others left without being attended to. The methods available to terminate a pregnancy were precarious. In most cases, metal clamps or reused probes were used, which could not always be properly disinfected. Abortions were performed on old stretchers covered with stained sheets. The procedure was fast, painful, and dangerous. Some women screamed, others made no sound. After the procedure, they were supposed to rest for a few minutes, but most were sent home immediately. There was no space to keep them. If they showed no fever or heavy bleeding, they were advised to rest and given some cotton, if any was available. In some cases, women suffered internal bleeding days later. When they returned to the hospital, it was hard to know if they would survive. Sometimes not even the doctors could predict it. The lack of basic tests and tools made every case a gamble. The mortality rate was high, but it was not always clearly recorded. Some died at home, without medical care, without certificates or dignified burials. In some neighborhoods, women's support groups emerged. They met in houses to share remedies, cotton, or ways to prevent infections. Some had basic medical knowledge and helped others with advice. It was not enough, but it was something. In these circles, little was said. Shame and fear were present, but there was also solidarity. Women who had recovered offered tea, broth, or simply company. Sometimes they cried together, other times they remained silent. In certain buildings, corners were set up where neighbors kept gauze, herbs, or bandages. Everything was reused, water boiled, hands cleaned with homemade alcohol, and infusions made to relieve pain. Amid the disaster, these spaces became places of silent resistance. Over the following months, doctors continued seeing the same cases. The numbers did not decrease. General reports spoke of a wave of female pathologies associated with trauma. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what it was about. Women kept arriving. Some were no older than 15, others grandmothers. All shared the same mark on their bodies, a damage that could not be healed with bandages or painkillers. Sometimes doctors could only observe, write a generic diagnosis, and move on to the next case. There was no definitive solution, only attempts. Pain, fever, and fear were part of daily life. What was once exceptional had become routine, and each new patient added another line to a medical history that never ended. Terror as a tool, propaganda, induced fear, and extreme decisions. In the final months of the war, the Nazi communication apparatus focused all its efforts on creating an atmosphere of absolute fear. Official propaganda had no other goal than to spread information that would provoke panic. The media warned of alleged massacres committed by the enemy, describing scenes of extreme brutality, and claimed that the only way to avoid this fate was to remain loyal to the regime until the end. Stories circulated about bodies hung from trees, murdered children, attacked women, prisoners burned alive, and entire villages destroyed without distinction. Each new bulletin aimed to reinforce the idea that defeat would bring an unprecedented catastrophe. The most aggressive messages were signed by Goebbels himself, who, from his position as Minister of Propaganda, ordered the tone to be intensified and disseminated via radio, press, leaflets, and loudspeakers in the streets. He used short, alarming phrases repeated daily. In his speeches, he claimed that the enemy sought revenge, that there would be no mercy, and that the German people had only two options: resist to the last consequence or disappear as a nation. He also claimed that soldiers from the east took no prisoners and raped any woman they encountered, regardless of age. The constant repetition of these warnings created an unbearable atmosphere. Within the cities, loudspeakers placed on poles and buildings broadcast repeated recordings of patriotic speeches, military hymns, and warnings against defeatism. Newspapers published articles allegedly recorded by witnesses. People were said to have been beheaded, mothers forced to watch their children die, and houses set on fire with their inhabitants inside. Every detail was designed to create a sense of constant threat. The goal was not to deter the enemy, but to terrorize the population itself to prevent early surrenders. In schools, teachers read students' passages prepared by the Ministry of Propaganda, while members of the Hitler Youth distributed leaflets to neighbors. The entire institutional apparatus aligned in a campaign that sought not to inform, but to push collective despair. Fear became a tool of social control. The mere possibility of falling into enemy hands became a sentence worse than death, and that idea began to occupy the minds of millions. Goebbels wrote in his diary that Berliners had to be prepared for anything. He also noted that those who appeared weak had no place in the new stage. In his view, fear was not an obstacle but an ally in maintaining discipline. He encouraged the dissemination of testimonies about alleged Soviet revenge acts and authorized the circulation of leaflets depicting atrocious scenes. According to him, such stories were necessary to provoke a violent reaction among the citizens. Beaver recounts that the propaganda services installed loudspeakers in public areas to maintain a constant flow of messages, even when the population no longer had access to newspapers or radio. The messages spoke of torture, humiliation, and mass rapes, using blunt and direct language. The same phrases were broadcast for hours without variation, and that insistence created a state of continuous tension that ultimately affected the emotional stability of thousands of people. In many homes, the idea of a final escape began to be seen as preferable to being captured. Entire families stored pills, searched for weapons, or prepared cyanide. Some neighbors exchanged information on effective methods of taking their own lives, and there were reports of authorities distributing poison among their employees. The decision was not an act of individual impulse, but the result of a process of constant psychological pressure. The stories, repeated again and again, eventually turned into accepted expectations. The presence of enemy soldiers nearby was used as the final argument. Broadcasts reminded listeners that those who fell into enemy hands would lose all dignity. They were depicted as a horde coming to destroy, violate, and kill, and propaganda described these supposed attacks in detail, attributing acts of extreme cruelty to them. This portrayal served to justify any extreme action taken by citizens. Goebbels wrote that choosing death over surrender was an act of bravery and a model for others. In Berlin, several families made irreversible decisions on their own before the troops arrived. Some did so together, others separately. But in every case, they had previously heard or read the warning messages broadcast by the regime. Beaver notes that in some neighborhoods, neighbors found bodies in bathtubs, courtyards, or living rooms, always showing clear signs of preparation. Local authorities, instead of trying to dissuade such actions, reinforced the message that it was better to disappear than to be captured. The intensity of fear increased as the end approached. Official speeches spoke of an inevitable catastrophe and a sealed fate. The population was encouraged not to expect any help of any kind. Goebbels wrote that even those who had followed the rules would be punished if the enemy arrived. That statement extinguished any remaining hope. It was no longer about avoiding punishment for having fought, but about accepting that no one would be spared, regardless of their personal history. The terror was absolute. This atmosphere of forced resignation, carefully constructed by the High Command, ensured that surrender ceased to be a rational option. The only alternatives were to die fighting or to die by one's own hand. The possibility of survival simply no longer existed within the mental horizon that had been shaped by those in power. Every message, every speech, every order distributed in the streets shared the same goal: to suppress the will to surrender without the need for direct force. And in many cases, they succeeded. Revenge as doctrine. How barbarism was justified from Moscow. During the first weeks of the Soviet advance into eastern Germany, the idea of punishment was not incidental. From Moscow, a clearly defined message had been disseminated, telling soldiers that they were not merely conquering but returning blow for blow what the enemy had done before. Posters, official speeches, and radio broadcasts not only pointed to the collective responsibility of the German population for the crimes of the Nazi regime, but also turned that accusation into a tacit license to carry out unchecked reprisals. From the moment the Red Army crossed the border into German territory, many of its members acted with the conviction that they were fulfilling a mission of accumulated justice. Mass-printed pamphlets stated that every German village had to pay for what had happened in Belarus, Ukraine, or Russia. There was no talk of trials or legal arrests. The concept was broader and at the same time more brutal. What was proposed was a direct settling of accounts on the ground, without legal filters or supervision from superiors. Some internal reports warned that reprisal actions were getting out of control, but those warnings were ignored. The logic of the moment dictated that anyone with a rifle and the Red Star was authorized to respond with the means they deemed appropriate. In some cases, this included widespread looting, in others, beatings of civilians, and in many, the violence took even harsher forms. The magazine Crocodile, the satirical mouthpiece of the regime, published cartoons depicting Germans as cowardly rats begging for mercy after ravaging the continent. Meanwhile, speeches by political figures used terms like fascist beasts or monsters with human faces to refer to the defeated enemies. This dehumanization was not accidental. By presenting Reich citizens as an inseparable part of the apparatus of aggression, any moral dilemma about how they should be treated was removed. The aggressor was no longer just an enemy soldier, but also the elderly man walking with difficulty, the mother closing the door trembling, or the young man silently watching without resisting. For many, the invasion became a kind of inner liberation, where years of accumulated humiliation found a direct outlet. Orders from higher command levels avoided direct language, but their intent was clear. They spoke of exerting pressure, ensuring the enemy understood the consequences of their actions, and not showing leniency toward those who had caused the deaths of millions. In practice, this translated into a policy of terror carried out coldly, though disguised as spontaneity. Some officers attempted to set limits, drafting directives to protect infrastructure or demand respect for certain groups, but their instructions were frequently ignored. The prevailing impulse was one: return the accumulated suffering, regardless of who received the blow. Soviet soldiers interviewed years later recalled feeling a mix of satisfaction and vertigo at the possibility of acting without restrictions. For many of them, it was not a military campaign, but a kind of national catharsis. Among the fighters, the phrase, "they started it," was repeated as if that justification alone were enough to unleash any destructive impulse. The environment contributed to this mentality. German cities, with their streets still intact and their houses full of objects not destroyed by the war, seemed too clean, too comfortable. For those coming from the horrors of the Eastern Front, this was a provocation. Many expressed it in simple words: "They lived well while we died." This perception, fueled by years of constant propaganda, served as an argument to take everything they found, without asking for permission or offering explanations. The message from Moscow, though wrapped in official rhetoric, was not limited to symbolism. In every bulletin, in every public address, the idea was reinforced that revenge was not only legitimate but also necessary to reaffirm national dignity. The commander-in-chief of the Red Army, Zhukov, signed documents speaking of disciplining the enemy by example or branding the memory of the guilty with fire. These phrases were eagerly picked up by the press, which turned them into popular slogans. Some were even printed on leaflets dropped from planes over conquered populations. In the eyes of civilians, this meant that any act of brutality was sanctioned by a higher will. The doctrine of punishment did not arise improvisationally. From the first months of the conflict, Soviet media had instilled a binary view of the confrontation. The Germans were not simply political opponents, but bearers of an extermination project that had to be opposed with equal severity. Newsreels from the State Film Committee showed images of villages destroyed by the Nazis, accompanied by narratives describing children burned alive, women hanged from trees, and tortured elderly. Although many of these accounts were true, their systematic use and constant emphasis on the enemy's barbarity created an atmosphere of permanent outrage. This outrage, channeled in the right direction, served as a driving force to justify what came next. Within the Red Army, internal bulletins circulated emphasizing the importance of maintaining soldiers' pride and not intervening if popular justice sentiments were expressed forcefully. Some units had their own interpretations of these phrases, and what in some cases was a warning, in others acted as a green light. Confusion was part of the design. By not establishing clear rules, senior commands ensured that any excess could be seen as a spontaneous expression rather than deliberate policy. This ambiguity served the larger objective, to release collective resentment without assuming direct responsibility. At the official level, talking about what was happening on the ground was avoided. Reports reaching Moscow with complaints of abuse were archived or downplayed. When a foreign diplomat asked about the situation in the occupied zones, the standard response was that stabilization actions were underway and that isolated cases of indiscipline would be corrected. There was no political will to acknowledge that behind the triumphalist facade lay a systematic campaign of humiliation. Physical destruction was not enough. Morale also had to be reduced, making every citizen of the Reich experience, at least for a moment, what it meant to be treated as a dispensable being. Local newspapers under Soviet control began publishing texts signed by people's committees, celebrating the Red Army's actions as a liberation not only political but also moral. These articles emphasized that the soldiers had brought justice where oppression had prevailed, that every act of violence was a logical consequence of the recent past, and that Germany had to learn not to repeat its mistakes. This narrative resonated with the population on the other side of the front. In cities like Smolensk, Minsk, or Sevastopol, survivors of the Nazi occupation applauded the news of excesses committed in German territory. Not because they were insensitive, but because they felt their own pain was finally reflected. Over the weeks, this logic solidified. What initially seemed like an uncontrolled reaction became an unwritten system shared by the majority. Looting was tolerated as long as it did not affect strategic interests. Physical violence was rendered invisible if it did not interfere with troop movements. Public humiliations were ignored unless they provoked protests from other allies. Moscow, far from condemning these practices, reinforced the idea that the enemy needed to learn by the most direct means. Even when some local commanders, they drafted formal complaints. Their superiors reminded them that it was not just about winning the war, but about rewriting the balance of the continent. Political training within the army included sessions where the atrocities committed by the Nazis were reviewed, with an emotional charge designed to provoke immediate outrage. Photographs were shown, intercepted letters were read, and documentaries were screened. After these sessions, soldiers left with a sense of historical mission, as any action undertaken in the following weeks was presented as another step toward restoring collective honor. Those who doubted were considered naive, and the idea of holding back was seen as a form of weakness, to the point that some political commissars began denouncing officers who suggested moderation. In public discourse, the committed violences did not exist, but in private they were recounted with pride. The personal diaries of some fighters, which were found in military archives years later, show a disconcerting mix of pride, shame, and confusion. Some wrote that they had never imagined doing what they did, others that they finally felt the enemy had tasted their own medicine. But almost all agreed on one thing: what happened was encouraged, permitted, and in many cases celebrated by those who directed the war from the offices. Revenge was not an unwanted consequence, but an integral part of the plan. Those who chose another path, individual decisions. Amid brutal deployment, in an apartment building in Berlin, a middle-aged woman named Dora anxiously awaited the advance of the Soviet troops. Aware of the danger their arrival posed, she had hidden her youngest daughter in a large suitcase inside a built-in closet covered with folded clothes and old blankets. She had warned the girl not to make a sound, no matter what she heard. At that moment, the front door was smashed open. Dora stood alone before 3 armed soldiers who quickly searched the apartment. One of them began rummaging through the drawers of a dresser, while another headed toward the closet. The third approached Dora, observed her silently for a few seconds, and then signaled his companion to move away from the closet. The soldier obeyed without a word and went to check another room. When they finished searching the place, all 3 left without taking anything or touching her. As they closed the door, the last one turned his head toward Dora and murmured in Russian to take the girl out of the hiding place, that she was now safe. No more words were exchanged. After they left, Dora opened the closet and found her daughter sweating and trembling, but alive. In the following days, the woman did not see that soldier again, although she looked for him among the patrols crossing the street. His face remained imprinted in her mind. It had seemed young and tense, yet controlled. No one else in her building had been so fortunate. On the lower floors, other neighbors reported that the soldiers had been brutal. On the second floor, a mother and her teenage daughter had been dragged to the basement by a different group. On the 5th floor, an elderly woman was pushed down the stairs while trying to block the passage of an armed group. But Dora and her daughter were the exception. A second documented case occurred on the outskirts of Dresden. A pregnant woman walking along a country path with her brother-in-law was intercepted by 2 soldiers, Soviets. Noticing her condition, one of them stopped abruptly and ordered the other in Russian to lower his weapon. A brief argument ensued between them. The first one pointed at the woman, while the other insisted with aggressive gestures. Finally, the soldier who had intervened pointed to the ground and forced his companion to turn around. Both walked away in the opposite direction without saying more. The woman collapsed to her knees on the ground, while her brother-in-law helped her to stand. They never saw them again, In the book Befreier und Befreiter, the case of a young woman named Elsa is also recorded. She had been captured by a group of soldiers who dragged her into an abandoned building. One of them, older in appearance, asked to stay at the entrance to keep watch while the other 2 went upstairs with the young woman. Once they were gone, the man looked at Elsa and told her to run around the back, not to stop or look back. She hesitated for a few seconds, but seeing that the soldier did not move and had put away his weapon, she ran without thinking. She reached a side street where a group of refugees helped her hide. No one saw her in the building again. Days later, a local resident recounted that the soldier who had stayed at the door was arrested by his superiors for refusing to participate in night raids. The last news was that he had been transferred in a convoy toward the border. In a village near Kustrin, a young woman holding a baby was surprised by a group of soldiers who entered the house. One of them, with higher rank insignia, ordered the others to leave and stayed alone with the mother. He approached her, offered water and bread, and then sat in a chair without saying a word. After a few minutes, he told her to leave the village as soon as possible and not return. The woman took the child and walked away without fully understanding what had happened. 2 streets further, she heard gunfire. The officer never left the building. His body was found days later in the same chair with a gunshot to the head. It was never known who killed him. Among the statements collected by civil aid organizations after the war, there are multiple mentions of soldiers who diverged from the widespread behavior of violence and looting. A woman from Leipzig reported that a young Soviet soldier gave her a blanket and a piece of bread without saying anything before disappearing among the trees. Another testimony from the Mecklenburg region recounts that an elderly man was protected by a soldier who helped him carry water from a well for several days, accepting nothing in return. According to the report, this soldier was later seen being reprimanded by an officer in the street. Despite the general brutality that characterized many episodes during the Soviet advance, these isolated gestures remained in the memory of some victims as minimal signs of humanity. They did not change the course of events nor prevent the collective tragedy, but they did prevent some people from losing their lives at key moments. In reports collected by local authorities after the withdrawal of active fronts, the names of Soviet soldiers whose conduct was reported as respectful or even protective are also identified. In several cases, these soldiers were reassigned to other areas shortly afterward. No promotions, decorations, or official mentions of their behavior were documented. However, in internal Red Army files, some appear with notes suggesting discipline problems or lack of initiative in combat. A former battalion commander interviewed in later years, it was noted that most of those who chose not to participate in repressive actions were considered weak or unreliable. The command structure did not reward individual acts of compassion, and peer pressure favored unquestioning obedience. Yet there were those who decided to act differently, even if only once. Throughout the more than 400 pages of the testimony report compiled by the civil documentation team after the end of the conflict, barely a dozen of these cases are mentioned among thousands of accounts of violence. However, their constant presence in the memory of the few who experienced them shows that, even in the harshest contexts, there were individual decisions that did not follow the prevailing pattern. Most of these episodes left no names, ranks, or precise details, but for those who were saved by these gestures, each of those soldiers was remembered for what they did in that moment, not for the insignia they wore or the country they represented. The story of Dora and Boris was one of those exceptions. When no one wanted to look, witnesses, journalists, and the censorship of horror. At the end of April 1945, war correspondents began receiving contradictory signals about what was happening in territories captured by Soviet forces. Some attempted to approach areas where abuses were reported, but they quickly realized that their access would be limited or outright denied. Several reporters accompanying the Allied troops on the Western Front expressed concern over the absence of images or accounts coming from the East. As testimonies from refugees and Allied soldiers acting as liaisons with the Soviets accumulated, a pattern emerged that many preferred not to mention publicly. The most sensitive information was not published. Some correspondents sent it, but it was blocked by military censorship officers. Others withheld it voluntarily, aware that the commands would not allow its dissemination. In the early days of May, it became evident that the abuses committed by Soviet soldiers were not isolated incidents. Cross-references to accounts from civilians fleeing East Prussia, Silesia, and Berlin indicated that sexual assaults and attacks on the population were not sporadic. Newsrooms in London, New York, and Melbourne began receiving private reports from their correspondents, warning that the violence was systematic, especially against German female residents of all ages. However, these letters were sent in sealed envelopes or delivered personally by diplomats or returning colleagues, never through the usual military channels. One of the first to address the issue more directly was Osmar White, an Australian reporter assigned to the European front. Through his own sources and conversations with Polish, Czech, and American soldiers who had contact with the Red Army, he built an alarming picture. White reported that mass sexual assaults were part of a wave of reprisals against the civilian population. In one of his internal reports, he wrote that the number of victims could be counted in the hundreds of thousands, and that there was no real control by Soviet commanders. He also warned that the brutality extended to girls, elderly women, and pregnant women without exception. The descriptions were concise in cold language, but made it clear that it was not no rumors or enemy propaganda. White tried to publish part of his material in Allied media, but he received strict instructions to moderate the language and avoid direct references to the Soviets. In another dispatch, sent confidentially to his superiors in Australia, he explained that the victims were considered war booty and that there was a kind of tacit agreement among the Soviet High Command not to intervene. White himself noted that most British and American correspondents in Germany were aware of what was happening but avoided addressing the topic in their reports. Some justified their silence as a way to preserve Allied unity. Others simply assumed that the public was not ready to accept that the liberators could behave with such violence. Some Allied officers filed formal complaints about what they were seeing or hearing through their contacts. In several zones of occupation temporarily shared with the Soviets, British and American doctors reported the arrival of German women in shock, injured or ill, who claimed to have been raped by groups of soldiers. Allied authorities collected these testimonies but did not initiate formal procedures, arguing that they could not judge the forces of another country without a common judicial structure. In many cases, the testimonies were archived or simply destroyed. In an internal letter sent by a US commander stationed near Leipzig, it was acknowledged that Soviet soldiers acted with complete impunity and that any attempt to stop their abuses immediately caused diplomatic tensions. The same letter mentioned that in some towns the Soviets had been warned by civilians about the presence of hidden residents, which led to raids in basements, shelters and hospitals. Local populations' reactions were predictable: fear, silence, and in many cases desperate decisions that ended the lives of entire families. These situations repeated in different places with slight variations but always following the same pattern. Western occupation authorities prioritized order control and military logistics, relegating the demands of the German civilian population to second place, even when these included mass crimes. Allied military censorship, especially British, applied strict filters to war chronicles. References to mass rapes were systematically removed or altered. Some editors received explicit instructions to omit any mention of sexual abuses committed by Red Army soldiers. This decision was justified with political arguments: the need to maintain the alliance with the Soviet Union, the risk of fueling pro-Russian or pro-German sentiment among the population, and the difficulty of verifying the facts accurately. In London, several experienced journalists tried to make room to report what was happening, but their editors reminded them that such content was considered inappropriate in times of celebration for the end of the war. Additionally, the Allies' public relations teams reinforced a triumphalist narrative in which the Soviets were portrayed as heroic liberators. Portraying them as perpetrators of crimes could damage the public perception of the joint effort. Some correspondents began keeping personal diaries with details they knew would not be published. In those texts, scenes of horror, victim testimonies and direct observations accumulated that did not appear in the contemporary press. Many of these documents would only come to light much later, decades later, when military archives were declassified or when retired reporters decided to publish their memoirs. Silence extended even among the soldiers themselves. Some members of the British and American troops who had witnessed the consequences of the attacks chose not to speak on the matter, not even in letters to their families. Others did, but without going into detail. In certain cases, military doctors drafted clinical reports with vague diagnoses, avoiding mention of specific causes for injuries related to sexual violence. In field hospitals and medical posts, the victims were treated quickly without recording full identities or information about the perpetrators. The main objective was to avoid any diplomatic incident with the Soviet High Command. Some medical service officers protested this practice, but their complaints were unsuccessful. On the ground, the priority was to maintain cooperation among allies and not create internal conflicts during the territorial division. The Allied military structure, especially in areas near the contact line with the Soviets, displayed a pragmatic attitude. Documenting crimes could jeopardize agreements, so it was best to act discreetly. The immediate consequence was an almost total absence of official records. The only available sources were private letters, oral testimonies, and personal diaries. Despite the information control, fragments of truth managed to leak out. Some brief articles in regional newspapers referred to the chaos in the areas liberated by the Soviets, ambiguously mentioning situations of violence and disorder. However, these publications were minimal and generated little resonance. The major international outlets maintained the official tone, and reports by correspondents stationed in Berlin, Moscow, or Vienna References to sexual violence were replaced with generic phrases such as revenge against the civilian population or undisciplined behavior by some units. This ambiguity protected the Soviet commands, but it also limited the possibility of making visible what had happened. Even in Allied press conferences, when asked about conditions in the East, spokespeople avoided going into detail. Emphasis was placed on the need to respect cultural differences and to understand the suffering of the Russian people during the war. Any criticism of the Red Army was seen as a threat to the fragile relationship with Moscow. The result was an informational void that lasted for years. The international community, and even many victims, assumed that their stories would neither be heard nor validated. The horror remained encapsulated in private accounts, relegated to the realm of what could not be spoken.